So yeah, I mean, your project sounds like it's really, really focused on community, and having them have control over their narratives. And that's something that we feel really strongly about as well, you know, that grassroots level where community conversations on environmental issues should really be starting. So in terms of your project that you've been doing, how does your practice allow people from other communities to own their stories, to own their narrative?
I guess like for us it's a starting point of collaboration, and it's not us kind of imagining that, I don't know, we don't sit there and seek out stories that we think might be interesting and go, oh, that's a bit of a dramatic story, we're going to go and use that, and you know, use that as a platform to share through theatre. It's more kind of collaborative than that, and it's more like, I guess it's more kind of understanding from a very baseline point the stories that are aching to be told, and the power within those stories and the people who represent those stories themselves. So like one thing we're going to speak about today is we've made a show about domestic abuse, and it was really important when we were making that show to interview and build testimonies of people who'd experienced abuse, but not from a place of like, again, seeking the drama, but kind of understanding the nuances and the kind of context and the kind of complexity of it. So we interviewed like children, mums, we interviewed my mum, we interviewed friends, family, we interviewed men who'd experienced domestic violence, and we built a picture, and then we were able to tell the story in its full kind of context, rather than just kind of seeking out the kind of drama of something. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's more, and more as Commonwealth is growing. I mean, it kind of says it in our name, right? So Commonwealth is like reclaiming the idea of being common, of being poor, and the wealth that comes with lived experience, and the wealth of our stories, like all of our stories, all of the stories that get misrepresented, all the stories that go untold, and how actually there's a lot of power in lived experience, and there's a lot of power in politics and taking our place to share those stories. So it all begins with that as a starting point, and then seeking out the stories and collaborating with people to tell those stories. And they might not necessarily be actors. We might work, like we've done a show with female Muslim boxers who are 16-year-old girls from Bradford. And it was around them kind of discovering the power that they had within themselves to tell that story, you know, and supporting them equally in a collaborative way. Because there's loads of stuff that we learn from collaborating with people, and loads of stuff that we can teach people. So yeah, it's pretty much hand in hand in our practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's wicked.
Like really aware that Evie's not in the conversation and trying to find her.
For you, go ahead, Zakia.
I was just going to ask. So you know, you mentioned that quite. They're not all. You know, they're stories that can be very sticky topics, and in many ways, Jazz and I also, when we deal with history, it's that kind of thing. And so sometimes we don't know when, and we don't know when to and when not to. And we've also come to the idea that letting people kind of own the narrative around that story is probably the best way. But just because we're interested in knowing is that how is it that you even approach trauma through an art? I mean, it sometimes softens the blow, but does it really?
You ask great questions, guys. So for me, like, especially with the domestic violence play, it was something that I experienced myself. You know, I grew up in a violent house with my dad and experienced it as an adult. And there was a cathartic experience of being able to stand in my truth, really, and tell the complexity of it. Because I think when people are looking at like domestic violence, they kind of see the violent side of it. They don't see the kind of like crazy control or the relationship itself, you know, like how someone might go back time and time again, or the reasons why people might stay in that abusive relationship. Or, you know, when I was growing up, I used to think that it only happened to poor people. Domestic violence only happened to poor people and people like me. But actually showing that was like it happens to a range of people. It's not just because you're one person. So for me, I guess it was kind of like a healing process of being seen and of being heard and of being in control of telling the story. And it wasn't just my story, it was many people's story, because we interviewed lots of different people. But I think for them as well, like we especially made like the first time we ever showed that performance. So the performance was in a house, in a street. And the first time we ever showed that, we shared it with people that we interviewed. And for people to see their interviews come to life and be recreated in a house, in a room, by a performer, with the knowledge that that is going to go on a tour and that is going to hopefully influence like policymakers and police and people who are dealing with domestic violence day to day, that's where we felt like real change would be born. You know, like actually there's something very powerful in your kind of experience being used for that to change the future.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard, it's complex, and everyone's experience is different, and everyone, everyone's trauma is different. But I think it has to be carefully managed. You have to be sensitive, and you have to be flexible enough to know that all those experiences are very different.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to hear more about Commonwealth, and hopefully Evie will be with us as well. But yeah, I guess that's goodbye from me and Takia. Yeah.
Bye.
You guys, take care. Ah, cool.
Hi.
Hey.
Oh my god. Hi. I'm so sorry. I was in the wrong browser. Hi, Jasmine. Hi.
Cool. So I kind of touched on it, Evie. I kind of shared a little bit about Commonwealth and what we do, but I wonder if you just want to say that from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know what you've said now, but I think Commonwealth, we always started to be political and make change, basically. So we were always interested in how we could make the most change possible. So for us, that felt like it was important to work site specifically and work in communities and not in theatres. And also to, kind of work with people to make things. So rather than us coming up with all the ideas, we work with people and generally make quite a big group of collaborators to make work with. So yeah, that's, yeah. I don't know what else you said.
Yeah, so we've been going for like 10 years. And basically we started off in a very DIY way. So we started off by making shows in big empty buildings that were kind of left to ruin. So we were working in Bristol and there was a lot of empty buildings at the time. And it felt like a really kind of positive way. Well, it felt like that was a resource for us, like these empty buildings. So we worked with like lots of friends where we would basically take over the buildings, collaborate with loads of people and make massive shows. And I think for both of us, it got to a point where it felt like we were making the audiences that were coming to our work were a lot of our friends or a lot of other artists. And it felt like it was hard to change anything. It felt like, every time the audience come, that it was people with the same political views as us or people who'd experienced theatre time and time again. So we both decided to really focus on what it meant to move away from that. Would you say that's right, Evie?
Yeah, and so basically we had an idea for a show that came because an ambulance came from my next door neighbour, and then we kind of had this idea around how could we take the work that we had been making, which was promenade and immersive and happening in multiple rooms, and apply that to a political piece, basically. So we wanted to make a piece about domestic abuse and to stage it in a house with multiple rooms. And we knew that house then had to be on like a residential street. So then straight away, it shifted away from those kind of audiences of like people who had the same political views as us, because we were on a street and we were completely with just the neighbours. And we worked across 5 streets across the UK. So we would find houses in different places. And that show was called Our Glass House. I think Rhiannon might have mentioned it. So that kind of started us on a journey of working in spaces and then really being on people's doorsteps and seeing what that meant. So that was like a real kind of street theatre moment. Mm-hmm. And then from there we've worked in boxing gyms and warehouses and old tin factories and city halls and like lots of different spaces that bring different groups of people together, because we knew that space was important and that the theatre buildings and institutions are often the barriers. So we felt like actually a bit like what Jasmine and Zaki were talking about just now, it was like instead of like you kind of just go to people and you go to where they are and where they're working, rather than expecting them to come to you. You kind of go to where people are and where people live. So a lot of our work became about that. Yeah.
And I guess for us as well, like, you know, it's really clear that you know, theatre can often be quite elite. It can be quite a space for people who are of a certain class, and like actually we're really interested, not necessarily, we're not interested in that. I think we can say that quite clearly. We're not interested in that kind of theatre. And actually what we were seeing when we were both returning to our hometowns, which are really working class areas in the UK, is we were seeing areas that, you know, where art was being made, but it wasn't being championed. And for us, like working in those fan spaces in working class communities feels really, we're just really excited by it. That's it. And we see it as complete collaboration. Like we can, you know, in one of our shows, we collaborated with a group of steel workers to make a show about the Save Our Steel campaign. And it was amazing. It's incredible to collaborate with different types of people rather than just like artists all the time.
And I think we were also really aware, because we're working class and from working class kind of areas, we were aware that a lot of the political discussions that people were having, that people we grew up with, and people were aware and conscious and talking about politics and talking about change in the world, and a lot of those conversations that are quite urgent were going on, but they weren't ever represented in theatre or on the media or in TV. So actually it felt also important that for us, we always wanted to speak about things, and we never wanted to patronize people or assume that people wouldn't be interested in, you know, like the things that we were talking about. So we're like, actually, it's really, it was always really important to include a lot of people in discussions around big political actions as well. So we did a show called The Deal versus the People, which was about the about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. And with that, we basically worked with lots of people and we'd never really heard about that trade deal before, and then worked with lots of people to make that play. And it was about, okay, what is it that we don't know about these trade deals that are getting made and that are happening in our lives? And so what do we know and do about that? So it was always like this process of finding out together and making together, because we don't know the answers at the beginning, but we kind of go on a journey.
Yeah. And just to like, because Our Glass House keeps coming up quite a bit for us. And I was just thinking, like, for us, like, I think it was like the first process where we realized that social change could really happen, that could really explode. And I wonder if we should share a little bit about what that means to us, like theatre that makes social change.
Yeah. I think definitely with Our Glass House, the reason why it felt like it made so much change was because basically quite quickly we realized, because we kind of started, a few people came by accident to the first show we did who were police officers and social workers, and they kind of came by accident. And then we started to have this bigger audience of social workers and nurses and midwives and police, and like lots of different people started coming to see the show, and we started to realize the kind of change you can make on multiple levels of people who are actually working in domestic abuse, and that this experience for them of being in a performance house and the house kind of living and breathing around them and seeing characters real time and feeling that, and it being an emotional experience rather than a training, kind of cold training experience. So it felt for us like the emotional drive was really important. Would you say that?
Yeah, and I reckon, like, I think it was a real clear personal political journey for both of us. Like Evie was saying, like the birth of this show came because her neighbour had an ambulance call for her in the middle of the day. And then, as I was saying, when we started talking, Evie called me, and I'd experienced domestic violence all my life from you know, my mother's partners and then from my own partner, and I've never shared that with Evie until that moment. And then we started to kind of unpick our own personal relationship with domestic violence, and then started to interview other people who'd experienced it, from like women to men to children, to really build a picture. And it felt like all along the journey of making that show that we knew that we were going through the right direction, because it felt like it was so based on truth and it was so nuanced. It wasn't one version of a story. It was so many different versions of a story. And with Our Glass House, we like toured it to 5 different locations across the UK. We went to Edinburgh, we went to London, and every time that show was reborn in a different house, in a different city, it felt like the invitation was for the audience to bring us gifts. So many times we would do the show and someone would turn up and say, well, that happened to me. I want to share these letters I wrote in that experience. Or we always felt responsible for the audience, because it was such an intense experience that after every show we would hold like a post-show discussion where we'd all sit in the living room, we'd all talk and unpick domestic violence and our kind of roles as citizens and as humans, of what we should do if we knew it was happening to people, or if it was happening to us. And I think it was in those moments that real kind of change was being born on a very local level. And then also on a very big political level. In Edinburgh, we had this chief of police come, and he released a statement saying he was going to look at domestic violence in a different way. So he was going to look at the kind of psychological effects of domestic violence and how we could change the law. So it felt like it was working on lots of different levels, on lots of different layers. And the show being layered itself, it felt every aspect of that show felt like layers to me. Yeah,
I think that's the thing about theatre and the type of theatre we're making, I suppose, is that just hearing you talk, then it's like, I think it's about the complexity of things. And often in the media, obviously they're going for the most simplistic version of people. So like newspapers and TV will go for the most simplistic version of people and events. And actually we know, like everybody, we all know really how complex things are and how complex people are. And so with theatre, because our work is often with a simultaneous element, or it's not necessarily completely like narrative driven, it's more about the thoughts and the feelings and a kind of collision of different thoughts and feelings. So you can get to that, like the complexity of people and of situations. So I think, yeah, that's definitely something where it feels like theatre can make that change, can make a bigger change or send out more ripples. Like we always see it as like someone might just see a theatre show, but then that kind of creates a ripple in their life or creates a change for them, and different things happen as a result of people seeing theatre shows. Because often, like Rhiannon, we'll be like, oh, you know, why are we even theatre makers? Like, what's the point? You know, like, why don't we try and become lawyers or something, or like something a bit useful, or like become a, you know, nurse or something useful. And then I think for us, what keeps us coming back to theatre? What would you say, Rhiannon? What like keeps us coming back to theatre?
What keeps us coming back?
Like, why do we believe in it?
Well, I just think that it's like absolutely it's where I believe that it's where social change can be born. And there's something about, I mean, I'm looking for words now, like a one-liner. But for me, it's about the live aspect of it. Like actually, like the thing I love about theatre, I hate it and I love it at the same time. But the thing I do love about it is there's never one experience that can be repeated. The audience will always be different. What they witness will always be different. And in that moment, they're all together, they're strangers, and they're bearing witness to an event that will, you know, hopefully shape how they see the world. And it's not just a live event either. It's like the journey home, the conversations they might have as they leave with people they've never met before, or I don't know. I just think it can go really deep. I think it's like a form of ritual, and I'm really scared if we lose it, you know.
Should we talk about like what our plans are for the future? Because we've kind of been thinking, there's a question on the chat about how do we respond to this discussion about how the theatre sector must be saved post-COVID. And I think it's funny for us because the kind of people have said to us, oh, the theatre industry now, it's like being totally decimated. But I think for us, because we've never worked in buildings and we've never worked on a kind of commercial model, actually coronavirus hasn't necessarily affected us that much. Like, of course, we had to postpone certain things, but we've actually kept making shows. So we're making a show called Peaceophobia now, which is in a car park, and it's about Islamophobia, and we're making it with drivers from Modified Car Club and Speakers Corner, which is our collective in Bradford. And because that's in a car park and not in a theatre building, we don't have to worry about seats being crammed in together, or people are free to move. Like, people can walk and move and navigate their own kind of social distancing. So actually, for us, that coronavirus in a way sounds awful, but it's given us more time to think and work and respond to what's going on in the world. Because actually, yeah, it's because we don't work in buildings, it just doesn't have the same impact on us, which is, yeah, just from our position. It doesn't affect
I guess we're kind of like outsiders from the theatre. Like we're not seeking like to work inside a building like the National Theatre, like inside their main stage. That isn't what we're about. And actually, if this moment can teach us anything, it's like how that change kind of transfers from thinking about the money, the box office, the this, like the kind of corporate capitalist nature of theatre that is absolutely rancid and should be, you know, dismantled as far as we're concerned, and like how it can be something different, something that is more centered on the human lived experience, how it can be more equitable, how it can be more democratic, really. So it feels like, you know, potentially an inspiring time where things can really shift for the better.
Yeah.
Evie, can you talk more about like your plans for Bradford? So before I say that, basically we both live in our hometowns. So we met in Bristol and we started our work there by squatting those big empty buildings. And over time, we've decided to both return to our hometowns. So I'm in Cardiff and Evie's in Bradford. And historically, I would say, disagree if you want, Evie, they're places where people tend to leave and not go back to, especially artists. They tend to go and seek other more exciting cities, but we made a conscious decision to go and live in the cities that we do. So we're both back home and we're both turning our focus for a little while just to a bit of a hyperlocal sense, as well as having like an international sense at the same time. So we just wanted to share a little bit more about what we're planning to do locally in our areas.
Yeah, so in Bradford, we've been here for about, like, I moved back to Bradford just when my son was born, basically. So been here for 9 years. And basically we've always kind of worked making a show in a kind of community or in a specific place, and we've worked in lots of different places. So we've had lots of kind of different homes and networks and routes, but actually it feels like, although we don't necessarily want to have a big kind of institution, we feel like we do want to be rooted in one place. So I live now like one street from where I grew up, which is a bit bizarre, but my mum still lives there, so it made sense. But so basically we're thinking of buying a house, like a residential house, just around in this area, and making that house into basically an artistic space. So it'd be a space where we can kind of perform our Glass House, because we really love that show. But also the house itself can become like a community art house space for people on the street. And it's got an amazing like green space outside, which is at the minute quite neglected. So we're thinking about how we can work in the green space, like with the community. It was really interesting hearing Zaku and Jasmine speak, because there's also a community project up the road where the residents got together and then all built like chicken coops, and then it's like mainly elderly people who are kind of maintaining the chicken coops, and they're mainly men who at home in Pakistan would have looked after chickens. So basically it was all of this outdoor space, and we're thinking about how can we work with people in the area to like make that outdoor space outside this house kind of come alive. And the house, we're thinking artistically, like how can we use the house as a multi-room kind of point of inspiration, basically. So we could have installations at different times of the year. We could have like a kids treasure hunt in the house. We can do lots of different things. We can do workshops, like loads of different things that can be run from the house as if the house is a venue. Yeah, so that's kind of the plan in Bradford. So we're just exploring how we make that happen. But so far it's, feels really positive.
And then, so I'm back in Cardiff, and I've not been that focused on Cardiff really for a little while, because I've been up and around making shows with Evie and touring them. And in the past year, I've really started to think about what Cardiff could look like for Commonwealth. And what we've done is move back to the council estate that I grew up on. And historically, there's been no theatre there, no theatre shows, no theatre company, no theatre building. But it's historically been an area also very rich in talent and culture. So there's a really notorious, amazing dance troupe called the Underdogs, who came from the estate, who it was run by Chantal, who works with us, her mum, who basically used to throw dance lessons in her kitchen. So she used to have like 40 kids dancing in her kitchen, and they would tour Europe with their amazing dance hip hop skills. So it's had this whole kind of movement, but it's never had any subsidized art sector kind of going on there. So we moved back, and what we're considering is like, how do you co-create with the whole community program over 3 years? How do you co-create the shows, the program, co-curate the activity that's going to happen? What does that look like? So we're just starting to investigate what that could be. And we've programmed our first show, which is really exciting, which is going to be someone else's show that comes to the area. That's going to be made with 5 local performers who will all be paid. And these historically wouldn't be performers that, would be paid. So it's kind of just tipping things on its head and just making sure there's opportunities for local people to basically be the stars of their own shows and be the tellers of their own stories. And it feels for me a little bit like setting the record straight. So for so many years, it's always been, and I think it's the same for Evie and Bradford, the chat that goes on about places and how shit they are, or like when I was growing up, John Redwood, who was the former Secretary of State for Wales, absolutely ripped our community apart, demonised it completely, said the single mum should have their children taken off them. So that's the kind of narrative there's always been about in our estate, and it runs deep there. Like, it's still, even though I was 12 years old when that happened, 20 years later, it's still there, it's still very solid. So what we're trying to do is kind of counteract that, I would say, and find a new narrative, the narrative that no one talks about, and just remember what we do have and what power we have as a community. So yeah, we see like the whole estate as our playground really at the moment. Like, that's where we're working. And what's amazing, what's terrifying is that I looked at some data recently, and it was like 17,000 people live there, and 44 of them had been to the theatre in 2017. So we're starting from a place of zero, but actually that's quite an interesting place to start from, because yeah, we're not asking them to go to the theatre in town. We're saying, be in the theatre that you want to see, it's your theatre too. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment. And I think what's really important for both of us is, like, for us, it isn't just about the local, it's also about the international. It's also about how you connect with the rest of the world. And that's what theatre is really good at, is connecting people, connecting stories, finding kind of commonality across different different places, different people. And I guess what our hope is to talk about what happens locally, but also how we connect up with other organizations across the world, other artists, and how we keep the work being not just small but really big.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting because, like, say with Pisophobia, they play about cars. Like, there's modified cars when someone builds their own engine, and there's modified car communities all over the world. And there's a very like specific kind of scene in Bradford, but actually people all over would relate to that. And also because the show is about Islamophobia, so many people will relate to that as well, to how you're demonized for the car you drive, for your religion, for everything. That there's so many things that people are being demonized for all the time, and it's like, how do we take control of those narratives? Because actually the media won't do that, but theatre can do it in a very different way that brings people together. I'm aware we've got questions. One question is, so how can more work like ours and more work of ours get funded? And I don't know, for us in our early days, we worked with lots of different funders, so like NHS funder, like different, basically people like from a wide range of sources, so not necessarily arts funding. So we'd be kind of working with the council, we'd be meeting lots of different people, and because it was domestic abuse, we'd be there'd be little pockets of money that we'd be able to kind of tap into. I think for our work now, where we're getting really local, it will be about kind of working out. And also it's really interesting because the councils have been so stripped of money, so you just can't really go to your local authority anymore, because some, obviously, like all youth and community centres have been completely torn apart. And that's where the argument and the kind of narrative around the theatre sector does feel quite tired, because I kind of feel like, well, so many libraries have been destroyed, youth centres have been destroyed, community centres have been destroyed, and there wasn't this big public upswell for it then. And I know that, you know, there's got to be some sense of protection, but actually we don't really feel like it's theatre's place to step in and try and kind of like roll out the community work that people were doing for years and years and years. It has to be a different offer and in a different way, because I feel like probably a lot of theatres now are going to turn their funding or turn their activity to very localised things, and that could get, because they've never done that before and they're not used to working in that way, that could all get very lost. And for us, it's always about connecting with people who are already youth workers, people who are already community workers, like really working with the knowledge and the skills on the ground. And that's why we're called Commonwealth, because we believe in the wealth of common people and the wealth of that's already there if we work communally and in common with people. So it's not about kind of, just literally parachuting in, and like that's the term, but for us it's always like, okay, who can we work with, who's already there, like what's already going on, like what skills have people got, and working from that place.
It's like working from the asset place, isn't it? Like that everything we need is already there. And I think communities are getting wise to it, you know, they're getting really wise to people just taking the piss, to be honest. And that's going to get really messy. It's like actually go in with integrity and honesty and reason, and speak to people, because actually a lot of the talent you're looking for already exists in these places, you know. And I think just one other thing on the funding is we never believed that we were a company who could get funding. Like we never even started off believing that was even possible or that was what we wanted to do. And it was only till we made our glass house that we started applying for funding, and that changed everything for us. So I think it's that thing about integrity, is like Commonwealth was built on values and built on a mission that was about making theatre in working class communities, about changing the narrative, it was about people, it was about place. And that solidified like our reasoning for applying for funding, for getting funding, we had our mission, do you know what I mean? And it was the mission that has supported us all that time. So yeah, I guess like for people who have never got funding, it's like if you believe in something and you really believe in it and it's got integrity, you just got to go for it.
Yeah, and then collaborate. I think collaborating on funding bids, I think, is the way to go. So if you're genuinely co-creating and working with people, then I think you kind of also have to work with people on funding bids. So it's not just kind of us that get the funding, but it's actually shared between a youth project and us. And, you know, it's thinking more like collaboratively on every level, not just on the work that you do, but on the way that you organise funds as well.
The next question is a great question. Does the work you do need a new language? Do people feel put off by the word theatre?
Yeah, I think it's funny because I think we wouldn't say, "Oh, come to the theatre." We'd say, "Oh, come and see a show." And I think people still, the thing is you have to have a bit of a language so people still get it. Like when you say come to a show, and even like you were saying, Rhiannon, that in St Mellons on the estate, there's only 44 people out of 17,000. Here it's similar. It's like 98% of people have never been to theatre, and this is a population of 29,000. So I don't know the total numbers, but I think people, it's funny because you say theatre and it says it conjures up one image. And when we've gone and talked to people, it's always much more like, oh, it's a show, there's music, there's a gig. We're always kind of talking about how it's part gig, it's part car rally, it's part this, and it is a show and it will be emotional. So I think it's always, we kind of try and paint a bigger picture around what a show is, kind of thing.
Yeah. I also think there's something on reclaiming the word theatre. Like actually, like why can't we call it theatre? And surely this is the way theatre should be.
Yeah. It's funny though, because I don't necessarily think it's a barrier. I think the kind of image around it is the barrier. So once you've kind of really chatted to people on their terms, then it doesn't really become a barrier anymore because people are interested. I genuinely think that people are very, in our experience, whenever we've gone into places where people haven't necessarily gone and watched theatre, people have still been really engaged and like really excited, because it's something kind of different, it's experimental, and it's like it's a different connection. And then we've had so many people, like they come to the show like 4 times, they've been to the theatre in their lives, and then they'll come to the show 4 times. It's such a different experience. So I think it's
maybe that gives us like the ammunition to like really shape what we think theatre can be, because I think when people start seeing faults in the theatre we're presented with all the time, you know, when they see something different, that's when they can fight for more. And that's when things are really interesting, I think. And also like, yeah, just I feel like the audience's relationship with our work does make it theatre, but actually what we do that's different to like theatre where you sit down is that the audience have a lot of agency. Like the audience for us are invited to go wherever they want. They can, you know, they can stand close, they can stand far away, they can make choices, you know, they can speak to the actors if they want. Like there's no rules in our theatre. Like it's basically, the invitation is like, come and have an experience. You know,
we don't tell people to come in and be quiet, basically.
Yeah, and to sit down. Like me and Evie get excited when like on our last show that we made, we were like, oh, imagine if the audience laid down in this moment and just looked at the lasers that we had in the show, you know. And it's like, and what else can happen in a theatre show? What else?
The live experience should be that it should feel that live, and that people aren't patronized and aren't kind of told like, oh, you go over there because you might be trouble, or like people brought their kids, like, and we trust people. So we had, you know, it's sometimes people are like, oh, should they be doing that, or is that okay? And it's like, we trust people to make decisions about their lives, basically. So if they want to come and see a theatre show and bring like everybody, the grandma and their child, like it's all fine. Like we're just like, it's kind of like a live and let live thing, that people are allowed to come in and then make their own rules and do it how they want to do. And I think that's what it's about, is like not changing the language, but also changing the rules around what theatre is. We've got one last question that maybe we should wrap up on. Has there been any lasting legacies of our work with communities that we could share, e.g. community groups continuing to be creative, visit art venues more, etc.? Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I guess there's so like we were saying earlier, there's so many different people, like people's experiences are all very different and very varied. But one person actually that is part of our story is a woman called Rhiannon who lives in Merthyr, and her experience was pretty incredible. So we collaborated on a show, and she was part of the cast, and from being in that cast, then the cast, who were the community cast, went off to basically set up their own theatre company. And it was a group of women who were over the age of 50, amazing, like this amazing group of women who would meet every week and put on shows. And then Rhiannon continued to be in contact with us, and basically she was like, I think she was about 48, and she had 2 kids and a husband. She used to sing in social clubs around South Wales. She went on to do a university degree in creative writing, and then continued to work with us and be in 2 R&Ds, and now continues to write. And she's got a really incredible relationship with a writer from the Valleys called Patrick Jones, who basically mentors her. So I think like that's just one experience of like one person's kind of journey. And I guess each journey would be different. God, there's so many
different examples, yeah. Because like we did a play called No Guts, No Heart, No Glory. It's about Muslim female boxers, and then from that, like, because they came into it as boxers or as kind of like young women basically, who then learned to box and performed. None of them were performers at the start, and now I think 4 out of 5 are still performing, still making things like in Bradford and starting that kind of movement, because there isn't really much of a performance or theatre scene here. So it's kind of how you kickstart things in different ways. I think Speaker's Corner is another example, which is a collective born out of a festival we did.
Yeah. It's kind of like those things are a bit have to be a bit gentle and a bit unexpected and a bit slow. I feel like those things over time are the things that influence real change in people's lives. And I got a text message yesterday from the soldier that we collaborated with on our last show about the arms trade. And he's like, yeah, we need to throw a Commonwealth and Friends party. You know, he's like got this kind of whole idea of like his journey has been one part of the journey for Commonwealth that's completely transformed his life. And for him, he didn't want to be an actor. He wanted to go on and get a job in communications, which he's done, and we supported him to do. So it's not always the story of people who go off and be creative. Some type of narrative is different for people. But I think that section that's important, like to us, the power, so much is conjured up in people, like the power of themselves, and like being able to check in and share that with each other feels really important.
Yeah, and I think that's it with Commonwealth. It's always about the personal. It has to be so personal for each person. So it's not like we go into it and say, I hope there's going to be a legacy project at the end and it's formalized in that way. It's more like, what do people need, and responding to that as we go through the journey, because it is always such a journey. So yeah, that's a bit around Commonwealth and like what we're about. And yeah, I think we're going to go back to Kathy and Amy now. Oh, that was easy.
The hang of it. I know how it works. It's all there. Oh, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much. I just, before you leave the stage, I just wanted to ask one question. That was, how does the kind of work that you do and the theatre that you produce and the way you work with communities kind of make its way into the education system? Because one thing is even language, and I was really interested in the idea of like, yeah, of course, why not talk about theatre, and that is what you're doing, but that doesn't seem to be the definition of theatre that is being necessarily talked about, whether it's in schools or, you know, in fact, people who do think they want to be in theatre and think they're following a certain trajectory and want to go to a, you know, performing arts place or to drama school. Is it encompassing the kind of work that you do, or what needs to change? Now, how does somebody who's interested in this learn about the possibility?
I think that's a really good question, because like obviously arts and drama have been squeezed so much anyway from school, so it's just not really there in like formal education to go even a bit experimental, because they're just, drama now in schools is about literature basically, so it's always like Shakespeare, and it's not necessarily about kind of how do we work on an emotional level to create a social change or whatever. But I think like, for instance, like with Peaceophobia, it's we're co-creating that with 8 young women from Speakers Corner. So in a way, that's their kind of art education. We have 2 apprenticeships at the minute of Commonwealth. So it's kind of like there's different ways in, I suppose, like people learn in different ways. So it's like, I don't know how we would get into like more formal education, because it just feels so squeezed already.
For me, this feels like the class problem in the arts. Like this is like the fundamental problem. This is why working class kids are not working in theatre, because it's not even being taught to them. It's not even a possibility. It's not even on the list. You know, like my niece just did a degree in theatre, and she's working as a care worker on a 0-hour contract for the past 3 years after graduating with a 2-1 in theatre. You know, it's like there is no way in. So I guess like the thing that Commonwealth can do at the moment is that, you know, we've got opportunities for people, but that isn't enough. It's not enough just to have like people, you know, like who we collaborate with on shows. So I think, yeah, this is the ongoing question that we all need to address. And of course, it isn't just you know, it isn't just us to address it. I think the whole sector needs to address it in a big, because it's also that learning of like, you know, we were lucky enough to go to experimental universities. Like we both went to university on the cheap as well, because you could at that time. And the university that I went to was really experimental, and we learned to fail. Like we didn't just, and it's that as well. Like, how do you learn to fail? How do you learn to be creative? You know, I never learned about business. I just learned about being an artist. It was amazing. But those places don't exist anymore, those radical places of learning. So yeah, I think it's an ongoing question I don't have an answer for, but
I think we need to dream them back into existence then.
Or set up our own schools, like our own schools of thinking, where we can work with our young people and like just get them to experiment and find what it is for them. It's like, it's not telling them they should be like, oh, you're going to be an actor. You know, actually let them decide what. We did a workshop the other day with 35 grime artists who were all 11 years old, and they were buzzing. They were like
they were amazing. Like one 11-year-old had made 2 tracks that he'd sold online, and he's 11. You know, like is that how we supporting these kids to be creative? You know, so I think it's there. It's just like how, it's all of our responsibility cross sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys. Like that was incredible. And also I think one of the themes that's come through the last 5 days, sure, has been like there are some parts of the system that just need to be dismantled, and like it is about not like reforming them or trying to make them more like you or more like the work of the future. And I just like I don't have a fully formed thought on this, but one of the things in my gut for sure is that like you guys are definitely in the future, even though so much of your work is just doing what we know, like, you know, like the right thing to do, right? Go to the heart of communities and do the work with communities, right? Like it's not like some revolutionary, like we need to go to Silicon Valley to ask them, well, how do we do this? Having said that, within the current capitalist system that is like valuing and class and like there's so many things that are and racism and all of this is just like interplaying here. I just feel like actually maybe it's not your job to like reform those systems because they're gonna die, like, and they're gonna die if we don't also like do things to really acknowledge where the future is in terms of like how people travel, how people. It's not saying people can't be together and stuff like that, but things are gonna happen differently in the future. So I don't know. Like I just wanted to reflect on that because part of my gut was really like, yeah, I don't know whether all your energy should be wasted trying to fix things that at the moment don't necessarily think there's even a problem, just waiting for like certain things to happen to go back to normal. Whereas like you guys just building like neighborhood to neighborhood in a like distributed, decentralized, community-led way, centering the stories from people who live those stories. I just feel like that's why I really like what Kathy's put together, like people living in the Department of Dreams. And sometimes I feel like we can get dragged into being like, how do we, and I'm all here to improve things that want to like be improved and want to change. But I have a feeling there's just something at the moment where there isn't that willingness. So like, why should you burn all your energy trying to like change that massive system when you could just work with people? I mean, the funding question is the next one, but I just wanted to say all power to you for your work. It's just incredible.
Right back at you, mate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Evie.